Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG with a different form video, something I've been looking at and researching for a little bit, and that is a budget compendium for the Pioneer format. Now, Pioneer at the moment is a little bit stagnant. There haven't been a number of changes with the format really lately, with Wilds of Eldraine really not introducing a lot of cards that impacted the format in a meaningful way. So the top of the format has largely remained the way it was, much like Modern used to before the Modern Horizon sets. Now, Pioneer currently is in a little bit of a lull, as it's not really the RCQ format of choice, and Modern is typically a little bit more of a popular format than Pioneer, but Pioneer does serve as kind of the gateway format between Standard and Modern, and so therefore it's a format a lot of people might get into, especially if they are a little bit tired of the Modern format or a little bit tired of the Standard format. Now, in order to aid in that, some people just don't have the money to dump into the high-powered decks, buying a full deck of Mono Green Devotion, buying a full copy of Rakdos Midrange, buying the full deck of Is It Phoenix? So how do you go about starting to build a Pioneer collection? Now, obviously, you could try to buy the format staples, the Tri-lands, the Shock lands, the various staples for different decks, and then kind of try to build from there. Alternatively, you also have the ability of buying a cheaper deck and kind of trying to build it up from there. This is more towards that audience, that how do you start getting a deck that's somewhat competitive maybe for an F&M level and kind of build it up from there. These resources are varying levels of usefulness. The first one is the 4 challenge decks or challenger decks from 2022. These include Is It Phoenix, which has a little bit of an addendum that it has a ban card in Expressive Iteration, but if you play the exact 75 from the Challenger deck, you are legally allowed to play it. But basically, this is a good introduction to the Is It Phoenix deck, one of the top 5, top 10 decks in the format. Not a bad investment, between $35 and $40. It's about $51 if you just sort of buy the cards individually, and it's a good introduction into one of the tier decks of the format. Dimir Control. Now, this is a deck that is not necessarily among the top control decks of the format, but it does allow you to start building some of the key cards for the control deck. Has a lot of key cards like Watery Grave, Field of Ruin, a lot of the spells that see play in the deck. You may have to invest a little bit more to make the deck a little bit more competitive, but still a fairly solid challenger deck for control matches. Gruul Stompy. No, this is kind of somewhere in between the Gruul aggro deck and the Gruul Sagas deck. But basically, this is just Gruul good stuff creatures. Get your basics of your main accelerators going, some of your adventure creatures that see play in that deck. You will have to upgrade this eventually, but it is a decent make gateway in the format, especially if you want to play a mid-range deck that isn't necessarily of the Rakdos variety. And finally, Orzhov Humans is a variant of Humans decks. Now, obviously, Mono White is the one that sees the most play, but still a fairly reasonable deck, and we'll certainly be taking a look at all these decks in one form or other to see how kind of competitive they are. But this is the first thing most people would think of as far as a bridge into the format. Now, another resource you can look to is MTG Goldfish, Saffron Olive, and some of the various other content creators have made some budget Pioneer decks over the years. Now, these decks are varying quality. Some of them are fairly reasonable decks, like Boros Convoke, which is almost the full-powered version of the Boros Convoke deck, which is probably a top 10-ish deck in the format. A lot of other ones are some interesting brews, things like Colossus Surprise for Metalwork Colossus, which we've done a little bit of work on in the format. Cycling Gift is a deck that takes advantage of a bunch of the cycling mechanics and then uses different things to bring them back from the graveyard or killing your opponent. Sultai Emerge takes advantage of the Emerge Eldrazi from the Innistrad sets, along with some ways to get those into play cheaper. And you have some other various decks that you can take a look at. All of these will be linked in the description of this video. Another notable one, Maze's End. As you get down into some of these other ones, some of them are a little bit outdated. Like, for instance, Blue-Red Prowess, very simply, has Treasure Cruise in it, which is now a banned card. So, while this is an okay resource, it's a little bit dubious in terms of your ability to these decks being either competitive or them being up to date enough that they can actually see play. Although there are some interesting brews like Duvious Challenge that you might want to take a look at. But this is certainly a resource that is well known by a lot of people and something you should take a look at. And we might visit a few of these decks on the channel. I'm planning on doing kind of a budget deck series for at least decks that I find interesting, or decks that other people might be interested in getting in the format, or decks that port directly to some of the tier decks in the format. Another resource, this is by MTG Zone, of something that I consider much better for the Arena client. However, Explorer is kind of feeding into Pioneer right now. So there are a lot of decks that are very similar. This covers a wide variety of decks people would consider mostly the aggressive decks. A budget version of Mono Red. The nice part about this article is it also shows one of the full powered versions of the deck or something similar that you can play. Mono Blue Spirits, which is one of the top budget decks in the format, also shows full powered Mono Blue Spirits. They're very similar. There's not really a whole lot of difference between Mono Blue. Red White Heroic, one of the more powerful decks in the format. I think this list is a little outdated, but still kind of gives you a baseline of where you can look at. Temur Battle Rage, I don't think sees play anymore, but even though this article is a little bit out of date, it does give you some idea of how to build towards a more complete deck. Mono White Humans, very similar to the Orzhov deck that you saw out of the Challenger decks. One of the top decks in the format, has a tendency to be in the top 10, top 15 decks, and it's certainly a deck you can be very competitive with. And then finally, Mono Black Aggro, which doesn't see as much play, but does give you another variety on the aggro archetype. And finally, 5-color Gates, which you will see kind of pop up every now and again, as it's a very interesting budget deck that has some control elements to it, which is kind of abnormal for these budget decks that you're getting into the format, but still fairly cheap to play and probably fairly competitive in an F&M environment if you happen to have a local game store that plays Pioneer. The final resource I will talk about is from Reddit. There is a dedicated poster known as Servo Token. Now, Servo Token, I don't believe they have any YouTube content or any video content, which is a shame because they've clearly put a lot of time into building budget decks. I will link the Reddit post that has this on it, but basically they have 50 plus budget decks. Some of them are ports of tier decks like Angels, decks like Humans, Greasefang. Basically, they have almost a budget deck for everything. Now, I'm very hesitant with this because they are probably the best resource I've seen for budget decks in the Pioneer format. I'm probably going to take some of the decks that I find the most interesting and play some games with them, see how they do. But all credit goes to Servo Token because they update their deck lists fairly regularly. They have a new sheet out each set. So this person has been very good, very diligent, and they've been at least doing it for the last 3 years because I believe this original post, I believe, is from 2021, but they just continue to update their spreadsheet with decks. This is probably the single best resource for budget decks if you're looking to get into the Pioneer format. And I did want to highlight and give them a lot of credit for taking the time to just constantly updating these very powerful decks. Now, whether the budget decks will catch on the channel, that's kind of remains to be seen how much of the content will do. I have a little bit of budget work deck already done, but with the Pioneer format in a little bit of a lull, I figured that I would just kind of give all these resources out there that people should be using to find budget decks to get into the Pioneer format. Like I said, we're in a little bit of a lull with the Pioneer format. The channel's been a little bit all over the place with content lately, as I've been kind of struggling to come up with newer and better content in a format that really doesn't have a ton of innovation in it right now. But I figured introducing people as a way to get into the format would be a nice way to kind of bridge things. And these are probably, I think, the 4 best resources I found. There might be other resources out there, or maybe you have some resources in your local community that you'd like to shout out in the comments below. But I just wanted to kind of shout out these 4 sources of getting budget decks to get into the Pioneer format. If you like Pioneer content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video.